Hey there, story lovers, this is Half-Blood Harry, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. Harry collapsed at Yule Ball and Aphrodite burned every love potion Dumbledore used to block Percy. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Flame Diagnostic. The Great Hall had been transformed into something that almost worked. Almost. The ceiling was ice-sculpted and silvered, enchanted snowflakes drifting in patterns that were too precise to be beautiful. And the tables had been replaced with smaller, rounder things draped in white silk that picked up the blue torchlight and gave every student's face the quality of something preserved. The Weird Sisters were 3 songs in, and the dance floor was a press of bodies and bad coordination and the specific kind of laughter that sounds forced when it isn't. Harry was dancing, or performing dancing. The technical distinction mattered. He had his hand at Parvati's waist and his other hand in hers, and he was moving in the approximate direction of the music, which was the best that could be said for it. Parvati had stopped offering corrections 20 minutes ago. She was looking past his shoulder at something more interesting, which was most things. Harry didn't take it personally. He wasn't particularly interested in himself tonight either. The feeling had started an hour in. Not anxiety, he knew anxiety, wore it like a second uniform. This was different. This was the sensation of standing on a floor that had always felt solid and noticing for the first time a faint give beneath your heel. Not dangerous, just wrong, a calibration error. A compass needle that swings 4 degrees off north and you only notice because you're finally standing still enough to watch it. He tried to place it, couldn't, kept moving. Across the hall, Ron was doing something with his face that suggested Hermione had said something he disagreed with, and they were both sitting very straight and separately, and Harry was glad he was on the dance floor where he didn't have to navigate that. Victor Crumb was dancing with Hermione and moving like a man who'd been told dancing was a form of combat and had prepared accordingly. Cedric Diggory and Cho Chang were good enough that Harry watched them for exactly 3 seconds before looking away, because that was the precise point where it stopped being admiration and became something else. Parvati said, "Are you all right?" "Fine," Harry said. She didn't push it. She was too polite or too tired, or had correctly identified that the answer was procedural rather than informational. The music changed. The Weird Sisters moved into something slower, and Harry and Parvati executed a mutual, silent agreement to stop actively dancing and simply stand near each other in movement-adjacent stillness. The hall smelled of something floral, some charm Professors Sprout and Flitwick had collaborated on, and beneath that, the candle wax and the starched linen and the specific warmth of 400 bodies in an enclosed medieval space. Harry's right hand prickled, not pain, not magic exactly, more like the feeling you get in your teeth when the temperature drops fast. A wrongness in the material. He flexed his fingers and Parvati glanced at him and he gave her a smile that didn't mean anything, and she returned it with the same currency. His goblet was back at the table. He'd had 3 drinks from it over the course of the evening. A sip before the first dance because the evening required something to do with his hands. A second larger drink when Malfoy had made a comment about his dress robes that Harry had absorbed without responding because he was managing himself. And a third at the halfway mark because it tasted odd and he wanted to know if it tasted odd twice. It had, he'd noted it. He had not done anything about the noting. That was the thing he would reconstruct later. The noticing without the responding, the gap between the signal and the action. He would understand later what occupied that gap and why it had been there since September of his first year. The compass needle swung 12 degrees, his magic not a spell, not a deliberate anything, simply discharged. There was a sound like someone hitting a deep drum once. Every champagne glass on the nearest 4 tables rang. A chandelier at the eastern end of the hall, the largest one, guttered and went out. The enchanted snowflakes in that quadrant froze in place and stopped drifting. Then Harry sat down on the floor, not fell, not crumpled. He sat with a strange deliberateness, as if his body had been given one clear instruction, horizontal, and had chosen the most dignified interpretation available. His knees went first, then his hands caught the floor. Then he was sitting with his legs folded under him and the cold flagstone through his dress robes and the music still playing because the Weird Sisters hadn't seen and didn't stop. Parvati said his name loudly twice. People turned. The music kept going for 8 more seconds, then it stopped. Percy Weasley was standing near the faculty table. This was his professional position for the evening, not a guest, not a student, but an observer. He'd been assigned to shadow Bartemius Crouch SR at the tournament as part of his ministry placement, which had sounded prestigious in August and had, by December, revealed itself to be the administrative equivalent of standing outside a room where important things were happening and being handed paperwork to hold. Crouch SR. was not present tonight. He had sent a note 3 hours ago. Percy had been present anyway because Percy was always present anyway because that was the mechanism by which Percy operated: show up, do the work, be seen doing the work, wait to be recognized for the doing. He had been waiting a long time. He watched Harry collapse. He noted the chandelier. He noted the ringing glasses, which he catalogued taxonomically: spontaneous magical discharge, untargeted, significant amplitude given the distance. He noted Parvati's voice, the specific pitch that meant genuine alarm, not performance. He noted the music stopping. Then he noted Dumbledore. The headmaster was on his feet before anyone else. This was not surprising. What was surprising was his trajectory. He moved quickly for a man who usually moved like he had always already arrived, and his path angled past the table where Harry had been sitting. Not to the collapsed boy, to the table, to the goblet. Percy watched Dumbledore's left hand. He watched it move to the goblet, cup it briefly, and then extract something from his sleeve, and the hand closed around whatever it was, and the hand went back to the sleeve, and Dumbledore continued walking toward Harry without breaking stride. The gesture had taken under 2 seconds, the movement of a man who had practiced it, or who had done something enough times that practice was no longer required. Madame Pomfrey arrived from the other direction, her healer's kit already in her hands, moving with the focused briskness of someone who treats emergencies as scheduling problems. She was at Harry's side in seconds, her wand moving in diagnostic arcs. Percy did not move toward the scene. He stayed where he was. He annotated. He had a very specific capacity for this, a ledger in his head with columns for observed and unverified and actionable. What he just watched went into unverified with a note attached, crouch adjacent, possibly, flag for review. He had learned, working at the ministry, that the observation only became useful when you knew what question to organize it around. He didn't have the question yet. He waited. The corridor outside the Great Hall was cold and badly lit. They'd taken Harry through the side door, Madame Pomfrey and 2 sixth-year prefects who'd been drafted into service, and laid him on the stone bench that ran along the passage between the hall and the entrance hall. It was the kind of bench that existed for architectural reasons rather than comfort, and Harry was aware of it specifically in his right shoulder blade and the back of his skull. He was conscious. Had been technically the whole time. The sitting down had been a system notification rather than an unconscious event. His body had decided something and carried it out without consulting him, which was, as it happened, thematically relevant. Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic charms were a specific shade of amber when they functioned normally. These were throwing orange-green at the edges. She pursed her lips once, didn't comment. Dumbledore came in 2 minutes later. He looked at Harry with the expression he always wore, warm, present, faintly concerned in the way of a man who is used to concerns being manageable. He said, "Harry, can you tell me what you're feeling?" "Wrong," Harry said. "I feel wrong." "In what way specifically?" "Like someone moved all my furniture 3 inches to the right, and I've been bumping into it for years." Dumbledore's expression did not flicker. Unusual metaphor. "Yeah," Madame Pomfrey said, albus, a flat word, a word that had a whole conversation inside it. Dumbledore looked at her. She didn't show him the diagnostic. She just held it for a moment, reading it herself, and then canceled it with a tap of her wand and said, "I'd like to run a more thorough examination at the hospital wing." "Of course," Dumbledore said. Harry watched his hands, both of them steady, easy in his robes. The left one resting near his sleeve and not moving, which told Harry, who had been watching sleight of hand since Dudley's birthday party 3 years ago when a magician had come and Harry had been more interested in how the tricks worked than in feeling left out, that whatever was in the sleeve was small and already secured. He filed nothing. He simply watched. She arrived before they moved him. There was no announcement, no crack of apparition or rush of magical entry. The corridor simply had her in it, in the way that a room can have a candle in it that changes everything about how the other light falls. She stood at the end of the passage nearest the outer wall, and she was not tall, not particularly, but she occupied her height differently than anyone Harry had ever seen. As if height was beside the point, she wore something that the part of Harry's brain in charge of cataloging things unhelpfully described as dress before abandoning the project. The color was wrong for the torchlight, too warm. The gold in it moved independently of the flame. Her face was the face of someone who had been finding humans both tedious and fascinating for a very long time and had made a workable peace with that duality. Madame Pomfrey had gone rigid, not afraid, she wasn't the type, but with the specific stillness of a trained professional confronting something her training had covered in a single theoretical lecture they'd hoped never to apply. Dumbledore turned. And something happened in his face that Harry had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It was the expression of a chess player who looks at the board and identifies, for the first time, a piece they had not accounted for. The expression lasted under a second. Then the warmth returned, the grandfatherly composure, the managed calm. "Lady Aphrodite," he said, "this is unexpected. Most true things are," she said. Her voice had a rhythm to it. Not an accent, it transcended the category of accent. The stress fell in unusual places, and the pauses came where you didn't expect them, and the effect was of something deeply old speaking in the borrowed clothes of contemporary English. "Move back," she told Madame Pomfrey, not unkindly. A direction, not an order. Madame Pomfrey moved back. Aphrodite crossed the corridor and stood over Harry and looked at him the way a goldsmith looks at a piece that's been badly set, not with pity. With the specific evaluation of someone who deals in the thing that's been tampered with and knows exactly what tampering looks like. She said, "You noticed at 8:47. The goblet tasted wrong," Harry said. "The goblet was the third dose today. The ambient compound is embedded in the castle's water supply on the east wing. Your dormitory is east wing." A pause. "You've been drinking it since September, 1st September. There was a silence. "How?" Harry said. "Diluted compliance tincture. Loyalty bonding base with a suppression compound layered on top. The suppression targets autonomy impulse and self-assertion reflex. The loyalty bonding creates effective attachment to designated sources of authority." She said this the way someone reads the ingredients off a container. "Your magic has been fighting it every day. It gets tired sometimes. Tonight it stopped fighting and instead," she considered, announced. Dumbledore said, "I think perhaps." "No," Aphrodite said without looking at him. He stopped. She sat on the bench beside Harry, which nobody had expected, and she put 2 fingers against the side of his head lightly, the way a doctor checks for fever before reaching for a thermometer. Then she said something in a language that Harry's brain declined to process as language. It was structured like speech, but felt more like instruction, like something said directly to the architecture of a thing rather than to the thing itself. The corridor smelled of burning rope, not smoke, the smell without the event, clean and sharp and final. Like the moment after something is cut that had been binding 2 things that shouldn't have been bound. Harry's vision went white at the edges, not painful, more like standing up too fast, that rush of depressurization, except it wasn't physical, it was happening in some layer beneath physical, beneath thought even. It was happening in whatever part of a person contains their assumptions about themselves. He saw things. Flashes, quick and involuntary, like pages turning in a book that someone else is holding. He saw himself at 11, looking at Dumbledore after the Mirror of Eris incident, feeling a rushing affection he'd never questioned because he'd never been given a version of himself that was capable of questioning it. He saw himself at 12, offered Snape's pensive access as a punishment, feeling the compulsion to comply even as something buried deep in him had produced the faintest signal. Wrong. He saw himself at 13, the Dementor attack on the train, and in the aftermath feeling not the sharp anger of a boy whose body had been invaded and threatened, but a managed, directed anxiety, Dumbledore-shaped, obedient, useful. He saw every moment the compass had been pointing wrong, and he had simply walked in the indicated direction. He also saw himself underneath all of it, the unmediated version, the one that had been making the signals and watching them get suppressed, and that version was not a bewildered, slightly resentful boy who felt perpetually behind. That version was furious, precise, paying attention in the way of someone who has spent years being told that their attention is not needed. The white faded. Harry said, "How long has it been in the water supply?" Aphrodite withdrew her fingers. "Since the morning after your sorting." He sat with that. He didn't examine it too closely yet. It was the kind of number you had to build up to. "Completely," he said. "Is it completely gone? Every compound, the loyalty binding, the compliance layer, the secondary suppression on your magical instinct, specifically the self-assertion channels. You will notice a difference in how your magic responds." She looked at her own fingers briefly. "You already do." He did. It was sitting in his chest differently than it usually sat, not heavier, not lighter, but present in a way it hadn't been before, the way his own hands felt present after he'd had them numbed for a dental filling and the anesthetic wore off. The magic was his, it had always been his, nobody had given it back to him. They'd just stopped taking it. That distinction mattered to him enormously, and he couldn't yet articulate why. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," Aphrodite said, not unkindly. "Gratitude is premature, you have a great deal of anger coming." She stood. Let it be useful. She turned and she stopped. Stopped because Percy Weasley was standing in the corridor doorway. Percy had followed because that was what Percy did with unverified entries in his internal ledger. He stayed close to the events until they resolved into something he could classify. He had watched Madame Pomfrey go out. He had watched 2 prefects return looking stunned and refused to answer questions. He had watched Dumbledore not come back. He had walked down the corridor with the specific deliberate pace of someone who is not sneaking and therefore cannot be accused of sneaking, and he had arrived in the doorway at the precise moment that Harry said, "How long has it been in the water supply?" He had the kind of memory that registered key phrases the way a court stenographer does, not because he decided to remember them, but because the architecture of his attention was organized around the principle that recorded information is the foundation of every legitimate action that follows. Aphrodite looked at him. Percy looked at Aphrodite. He knew what she was. His mother had a shelf of devotional volumes. Greek mythology was not his speciality, but the specificity of the presence and the compound heat of the impossible golden dress and the way the torchlight was doing something around her that torchlight was not designed to do. He cataloged it in under 3 seconds. Divine, Aphroditic specifically. The warmth in the air had an emotional valence to it. Desire, yes, but also its other aspect, which was truth, which was the thing desire stripped away everything else to reveal. He said, "Was I given something as well?" It was not a question. His voice was level. It was the voice he used when he was reading a regulation to a senior official who had broken it and was about to be made aware of the fact. Aphrodite's head tilted. Lower concentration. Different objective. She was looking at him with assessment in it. The goldsmith look again. Your ambition was the target. The compound doesn't eliminate it. It makes it misfire. It creates a gap between the quality of your work and its reception. You excel, the excellence fails to register with the people positioned to reward it. You try harder, the trying harder triggers the binding which produces deference in you that reads as lack of conviction. She paused. You were being kept subordinate, manageable, within reach. Percy was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Dumbledore said, "I think this characterization." "Sit down, Albus," Aphrodite said. She said it the way you say it to a dog you are not angry at yet. Dumbledore did not sit, but he went still, and going still from Dumbledore was the equivalent. Aphrodite held up one finger. The air in the corridor acquired a quality of attention. Then she produced, from nowhere, from the warm space between gestures, a small quantity of flame. It was not the color fire is supposed to be. It was the color of something that has been burning since before the world had a name for burning. She touched Percy's collar with it, and the flame moved, not across fabric but through something else. It traced an invisible architecture in the air around him, followed channels that ran through his bloodstream according to their own logic, and the burning rope smell was back. Percy's shoulders, which had been held in the military posture of a man determined to be unreadable, dropped about a centimeter. Just that. Just 1 centimeter, and Harry, who had been watching, understood exactly what that centimeter cost. The flame went out. Aphrodite said, "You were given a dose tonight. In your wine. There have been environmental compounds since last April when you moved your desk to the ministry floor that handles order-adjacent liaisons." Percy said, "The minister's recommendation letters. Redirected. The people positioned to receive them received instead a record-free silence, which they interpreted as a record of nothing, which is the correct interpretation of a silence in a ministry context." She said this with the flat precision of someone who has watched human bureaucracy operate for several thousand years and found it both ingenious and deeply tedious. Your capacity for this work was not the issue, your independence was. Percy opened his notebook. He had a notebook in Muggles spiral-bound, the kind his mother bought in bulk for the children who kept losing their quills. He had had it in his inside pocket all evening because Percy had a notebook in his inside pocket in the way other people have a heartbeat. It was not a choice, it was simply the mechanism of Percy. He opened it to a clean page. He wrote, April, compounds begin, confirmed divine testimony, 18 December. Ministry floor, order adjacent liaison division. Recommendation letters redirected source, Dumbledore adjacent channels, requires verification. Then he wrote, tonight, acute dose, wine, divine removal, confirmed. 7 months environmental exposure. He looked up. What was the binding compound? Aphrodite told him. He wrote it down. Is there a magical or medical record of? No, she said. That was the design. Is there a way to produce retrospective evidence that would satisfy a Wiesengamot standard of? No, she said again. Then, after a moment, there are magical resonance patterns in your bloodstream that would be visible to a sufficiently sensitive diagnostician for approximately the next 6 hours. A senior healer at St. Mungo's would be the appropriate avenue. Percy wrote this down. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him with an expression of measured, terrible patience. Percy said, "You've known me since I was born." Dumbledore said nothing. He was not the type of man who confused silence with innocence, and he was not the type to offer denials that could be operationally useful later. "Percy," Harry said. Percy looked at him. "The letters, the ones from the ministry, before you knew about any of this, did they feel wrong?" "Did anything feel wrong?" Percy was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, thinking. Actually thinking, which for Percy was a thing you could observe. The slight movement behind the eyes, the precision of retrospective assembly. "The second interview," he said. "For the Department of Magical Transportation." The interviewer, Halsworth, he was a deputy head, looked at my file and then looked at me, and there was a moment where his expression didn't match. He'd expected something. I was there. He'd expected something I wasn't registering as. He paused. I assumed I'd been oversold by someone. That the file contained a recommendation that outpaced my presentation. "Did you ask who wrote it?" "No." "One doesn't, a beat, I should have." "Yeah," Harry said, "we should have asked a lot of things." Madame Pomfrey, who had been standing against the far wall with the professional discretion of a woman who had seen things she would report accurately regardless of the career implications, said, "I need to run full diagnostics on both of you. Hospital wing. Now." Aphrodite looked at Harry. "Go," she said. "Rest." Then she paused, and the pause had weight. "What I've removed was artificial. What you are was always yours. The anger, the power, the instinct, those are not new. You have simply lost the dampener. What do I do with it?" Harry said, not helplessly. Like someone identifying a new tool and asking the person who handed it to them what it's for. "Exactly what you would have done with it 3 years ago," she said, "before anyone interfered." She looked at Dumbledore. The look lasted 2 seconds. She packed everything into it that 2 seconds could hold. Then she said, to no one in particular, "I find mortal politics very small. But this," and she made a gesture that took in the corridor, the castle, the night, the ongoing event of what Dumbledore had built. "This is not politics. This is ownership of people. That is something else." She walked to the end of the corridor where the stone wall was. She stopped being in the room. That was the only way to describe it. The corridor was immediately colder and quieter. And the torchlight went back to doing what torchlight was designed to do. Dumbledore said, "Harry." "Not tonight," Harry said. His voice was flat, not aggressive, not performed calm, simply a statement of terms. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The warmth in his expression was not gone. That was the thing. The warmth was still there. That was possibly the most significant fact about him. He cared about Harry genuinely, in the way of a man who believes that the quality of a craftsman's care for his tool reflects his professionalism. "There is a great deal I would like to explain," Dumbledore said. "Tomorrow," Harry said. Another pause. "Of course." He turned, looked at Percy. "Percy," he said, "just the name." "Headmaster," Percy said, "just the title." The exchange was a perfect bureaucratic transaction. Pure form, zero content, every word carrying an invoice. Dumbledore walked back toward the Great Hall. His robes moved correctly. His pace was measured. The composure was total. He had been surprised tonight twice by things he had not prepared for, first the collapse and then the goddess, and his composure was total. That was the kind of man he was. Harry watched him go and did not feel the pull of the old deference, the old love. He checked for it methodically, the way you run your tongue across a space where a tooth used to be. It was simply absent, not replaced by hatred, just absent, leaving the clean space of its own removal. He looked at Percy. Percy was reading what he'd written, checking it. His face was doing nothing visible, which Harry was beginning to understand was Percy's equivalent of a screaming room. "Your evidence disappears in 6 hours," Harry said. "St. Mungo's opens at 6. It is currently," Percy checked his watch, "a functional muggle thing with a rectangular face and a leather strap, 10:43. He looked up. 7 hours, 17 minutes. "We should go now." Percy's eyes moved to his notebook, then back to Harry. "Yes," he said, "we should." Madame Pomfrey said, "You are absolutely not." "Poppy," Percy said, which stopped her because Percy almost never used first names. "If you run your diagnostics at St. Mungo's with a senior healer present, the results are credentialed and on record by an independent body. The diagnostic you run here has the legal standing of a private medical opinion." He paused. "I mean no disrespect to your professional competence. I mean considerable disrespect to the institutional context." Madame Pomfrey looked at him, then at Harry, then at the door Dumbledore had gone through. Her expression was a very specific kind of tired, the tiredness of someone who has known something was wrong for a long time and has been finding acceptable reasons to not look directly at it. "I'll arrange a flu connection," she said. "Give me 3 minutes." She walked away. Her heels were very precise on the stone. Harry looked at the end of the corridor where Aphrodite had been. The torchlight there was just torchlight. The smell of burning rope was very faint now. He was going to hold on to it, not as a comfort, but as evidence. As a smell he would remember accurately in any subsequent account. He checked his magic again. It sat in his chest the way it had at the end of primary school, before Hogwarts, before the ambient compounds. He had not known consciously that he was comparing present to past, but the body knew. The magic was entirely, enormously his. He thought 3 years. He didn't go further than that, not yet. Percy said without looking up from his notebook, "For what it's worth, which I acknowledge may be a complicated calculation for you right now given the source, I'm sorry this happened to you." "The length of time is," he stopped. "It's a long time." Harry said, "Yeah, then same." It was the whole conversation. It was also enough. The great hall behind them was picking up again. He could hear it through the stone, the resumed noise of an event being insisted on. Someone laughing too loudly. The Weird Sisters moving into their next song. 400 people who had watched Harry sit down on the floor and had been told by prefects to resume their evening, and who were doing so because being told to resume your evening by a prefect was, at Hogwarts, a force sufficient to override most things. Tomorrow they would ask questions. Tonight they were dancing. Harry put his hands in his pockets. His right hand was warm, not feverish warm. Warm the way your hands get when you've been gripping something tightly for a very long time and you finally let go and the blood comes back. Percy closed his notebook. They walked toward the hospital wing without discussing whether they were walking together. They just were. Chapter 2, The Greater Good Comes Apart. St. Mungo's at 11:30 on a Friday night had the quality of a place that had given up on pretending emergencies were exceptional. The reception desk was staffed by a healer named Fitch, who had the manner of someone who had processed too many crises to assign them urgency rankings, and who looked at Harry and Percy and Madame Pomfrey and said, "Nature of complaint," without looking up from his ledger. "Magical compound exposure," Percy said. "We require a senior diagnostician. The resonance patterns are time-sensitive. We have approximately 6 hours 40 minutes before the evidence degrades." Fitch looked up at that. He looked at Percy's notebook. He looked at Harry's face. He looked at Madame Pomfrey, who gave him one precise nod. "Healer Oshiro," Fitch said. "3rd floor, tell her Fitch sent you and that it's a 7. "What's a 7? Harry asked. "Politically sensitive," Fitch said, and went back to his ledger. Healer Oshiro was a small Japanese woman in her 60s who had the focused energy of someone who had slept 6 hours in the last 48 and had decided that was sufficient. She listened to Percy for 4 minutes without interrupting, which was longer than most people managed before interrupting Percy, and Harry noted this with approval. Then she ran her diagnostics. The results were projected in a pale diagnostic blue above Harry's head, and they were extensive. Oshiro looked at them for a long time. She made no sound. Then she said, "How old are you?" 14, Harry said. She looked at the diagnostic again. 14, she repeated, in the tone of someone who has just read an invoice with a calculation error and is checking the arithmetic. "Yes." This compound pattern, the suppression layer particularly, this didn't accumulate over months. She was speaking to herself as much as to them, her wand tracing one amber thread among the remnant resonances. "The base layer is approximately 3 years old, maybe 3.5, she looked at him. "You were 11 when this began." "Yes," Harry said. She canceled the diagnostic, pulled up a fresh parchment. Began writing in the rapid, systematic way of someone producing a legal document rather than notes. "I'll need your consent to file this as a formal diagnostic record with the Department of Magical Health and Safety," she said. "It will be a matter of public medical record. The contents are sealed for 5 years under patient privacy, but the existence of the record is not sealed. That means anyone with appropriate clearance can request to know that a record exists and that it is classified." "File it," Harry said. She looked at Percy, ran the same diagnostic. The results above Percy's head were less extensive but structurally cleaner, the short-term acute dose from tonight showing up as a bright spike against the longer 7-month residue, which was faint but architecturally distinct. She wrote for longer this time. "The acute compound, tonight's dose, this was introduced via ingested liquid in the last 4 hours, she said. "Wine," Percy confirmed. "At the Yule Ball, Hogwarts, and the longer exposure, this began last April. April 14th, Percy said. That was the date I moved to the Order liaison floor. I can verify that through ministry records, Ashiro wrote. She did not ask the name of the person responsible. She was a diagnostician, not an investigator. Her job was to record what the body said, and the body was saying plenty. At 1:15 in the morning, she handed them each a sealed document, cream parchment, her official wax seal in green and silver, the scent. Mungo's authentication mark in the upper right corner, the kind of document that once it existed could not be made to unexist. Percy held his and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has just acquired a weapon he hopes he doesn't have to use and knows he will. Harry folded his in half and put it in his inside pocket and said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ashiro said in an uncanny echo of divine advice he'd received 2 hours earlier. "Get some sleep, both of you." He did not sleep. The hospital wing at Hogwarts, by the time Madame Pomfrey got them back and into beds and drew the curtains and declared visiting hours over in the specific tone that meant she intended to enforce it, was quiet and cold, and had the institutional smell of healing potions and starched linen and the faint residual magic of the diagnostic charms she'd run in addition to Ashiro's as a professional point of pride. The curtains between their beds were not thick, Percy said through the curtain. 1991, September 1st, Harry said, the feast. The ambient exposure began immediately. That means the compound was in the system before the sorting. The infrastructure was established in advance. A pause. Percy was writing. Harry could hear the scratch of his pen. That required planning, procurement. The assistance of someone with access to the castle's water architecture. Filch wouldn't know what he was doing with a potion compound, Harry said. No, but Snape would. Harry looked at the ceiling. Yeah, I want to be precise here, Percy said, and Harry could hear him choosing his words with the care of someone who understands that imprecision is a weapon against you in any subsequent official proceeding. We have evidence of the compounds, we have Ashiro's diagnostic, we have the goddess's testimony, which is not legally admissible anywhere but is personally significant. What we do not yet have is a documented chain from the compounds to a specific instruction from a specific person. He paused. What we do have is a strong circumstantial structure that a competent solicitor could develop. Percy, yes. I know Dumbledore did it. I know too, Percy said. I'm telling you how to make knowing useful. Harry was quiet for a moment. The ceiling had a crack in it that ran from the window to the door, and he'd stared at that crack through enough sick nights to know its every branch. He looked at it now, and it was just a crack. How are you this calm? He said. The scratching stopped. I'm not, Percy said. I am, however, extremely organized, which from the outside can look similar. A beat. I've spent 7 months failing to understand why my work wasn't landing. 7 months being useful and being treated like furniture. I thought it was me. I overhauled my communication style twice. I worked later. I documented more. He stopped. The worst part isn't that it wasn't my fault. The worst part is that I almost preferred it being my fault because at least that was a problem I could fix by working harder. The curtain moved slightly in a draft from the window. I did that too, Harry said. Not the same way, but I kept thinking if I was better at the war thing, if I was more useful as the weapon he needed, then the feeling of being wrong would go away. He stopped. It wasn't anxiety. I kept trying to treat it like anxiety. We were trying to solve the wrong problem. Because someone made sure we would be, the scratch of the pen resumed. By 2 o'clock they had established the following between them. 17 incidents of documented magical interference or circumstantially probable magical interference, organized chronologically in Percy's notebook. Harry contributed 8. The Mirror of Arist, Quirrell's defense against him, the Chamber of Secrets, and the inexplicable ease with which he'd accepted lethal risk without the self-protective instinct that should have been natural. The Dementor responses, which had been more manageable than they should have been once the compliance compound was factoring out his autonomous fear response. The Triwizard entry. Percy contributed 9, all ministry adjacent, all forming the same pattern. Excellence unreceived, deference manufactured, independence quietly dismantled. The Halsworth interview. 3 sets of recommendation letters, a departmental commendation that had been filed and then, apparently, unfiled. A meeting with a senior order member in which Percy had been more agreeable than his own notes from that day suggested he'd intended to be. 17 incidents, 2 people, 1 mechanism. At 3 o'clock, Percy put the pen down and said, "What do you want to do with this?" Harry said, "Confront him. To what end?" "To the end of looking him in the face and making him explain it." A pause. "And because I want to know if he can." I want to know if he's actually convinced himself it was right or if he knows it was wrong and did it anyway. Does the distinction matter? Yes, Harry said immediately. Then maybe, but I want to know which it is. Percy picked up the pen again. There are 3 viable approaches, he said, in the voice of a man who had been mentally sorting approaches for the last hour and a half while appearing to only be writing. We go to the ministry with Oshiro's documentation before we speak to him. We speak to him first and use the conversation to generate additional evidence. Or we do both simultaneously by notifying a solicitor prior to the conversation and ensuring anything Dumbledore says in response is witnessed. He paused. I recommend the third approach. It prevents the conversation from being characterized as 2 students making accusations, and it creates a contemporaneous record. Harry said, "Who do you trust at the ministry?" Percy was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was Percy time for I have had this thought already, and it led somewhere uncomfortable. Not enough people. The Order's influence is significant. He paused. I trust Amelia Bones. She is scrupulously procedural and she has no debt to anyone in the Order's orbit that I've ever identified. Can you contact her tonight at 3 in the morning? She's the head of magical law enforcement. She is, Percy said, and she would respect the urgency, and she would be furious to be woken at 3 in the morning, and I'd rather make her furious than let evidence windows close. A short pause. I'll send an owl, write it like a regulation, Harry said. She'll take it more seriously. There was a pause, then Percy said with something in his voice that was nearly warmth, that's actually correct. The owl went out at 3:15, Dumbledore came at 7. The morning light through the hospital wing windows was the color of cold milk, flat, white, shadowless. It made the room look like a place where facts were presented without softening. Madame Pomfrey had drawn back the curtains between the beds at 6:30, when it became apparent that neither of her patients had slept, and maintaining the pretense of separate recovery spaces was an inefficiency she declined to sustain. Harry was sitting up in bed. Percy was in the chair beside it, his notebook open on his knee, his tea untouched on the bedside table because it had been poured at the wrong temperature, and Percy had a firm position on tea temperature that required no verbal articulation. Dumbledore came in the way he always did, unhurried, warm, filling the space with the specific gravity of a man who has been the most important person in every room he's entered for 40 years and has made his peace with it. His robes were immaculate, his half-moon glasses caught the flat morning light. He looked at Harry and then at Percy and then at the notebook, and his expression remained what it always was, open, present, kindly. Good morning, he said. Headmaster, Percy said, which was the same zero-content transaction as last night. Harry said nothing. He was watching Dumbledore's hands. Dumbledore settled into the chair on the other side of Harry's bed. Madame Pomfrey had, Harry noticed, not offered to bring a chair, which meant Dumbledore had summoned one non-verbally before sitting, and the spell had been so practiced it was below the threshold of visible effort. He set his hands in his lap, both of them. I imagine, Dumbledore said, that last night was an extraordinary experience. Informative, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore's tone held a measured gentleness. I won't insult you by pretending I don't know what was removed. Or who removed it, he paused. The pause had the quality of a man choosing his first sentence in a complex argument he has been rehearsing for some time. I would like to explain the context in which certain decisions were made. I believe that context is. I'd like to hear it, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. This was the first time Harry had interrupted him, cleanly and without apology, and the look acknowledged it, not with offense but with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. Good, he said. Then I'll be direct, he said. The war was real, he said. Voldemort's return was not a question but a countdown, and had been a countdown since October 1981, since the night in Godric's Hollow when the killing curse reflected and created not a solution but a postponement. He said the prophecy required a specific boy, and that boy had arrived at Hogwarts not equipped to serve the function the prophecy described but equipped, potentially, to be developed toward it, and that development required a managed environment. He used the word managed without any register of its implications. He said, the compliance compounds were not designed to harm Harry but to prevent Harry from being a danger to himself in the period before he was operationally ready. He said the self-assertion suppression was specifically targeted because untargeted self-assertion in a boy with Harry's power levels and trauma history would have resulted in, he paused here, and chose the word with care, disruption. He said the loyalty bonding was regrettable. He said it the way doctors say there will be some discomfort. He said it as a concession, not an apology. Then he said the stakes were total. He meant it. That was the thing Harry had needed to check, whether Dumbledore knew this was wrong and had done it anyway, or whether he had talked himself into believing it was right. The answer was neither, precisely. The answer was that Dumbledore had looked at the word wrong and found it insufficient to the scale of what he was managing. He had looked at the war and found that wrong was a personal, individual category that did not survive contact with necessity at that scale. He was not unaware of the damage. He had simply performed a calculation that factored the damage as an acceptable input and moved on to the output. He said, necessary. He said it 4 times in the course of 4 minutes, and each time it arrived like a toll on a bridge. Each time it cost something. Harry let him finish. He had not interrupted again. He had watched Dumbledore's face the entire time, the genuine warmth, the real belief, the mathematical certainty of a man who has decided that the architecture of his conscience is load-bearing and must not be examined. When Dumbledore stopped, Harry said, "Then you should have asked." The room was very quiet. "Asked," Dumbledore said, "me." "Whether I was willing." Harry's voice was even, clean. He was not performing calm. He had passed through the territory of rage somewhere around 2 in the morning and had come out the other side into something colder and more precise. "You needed a weapon, you had a theory about me and a war to fight, and you looked at a 1-year-old survival and decided what it meant and what I was for, and then you built a compound system to produce the version of me that would be most useful for your theory. You didn't ask. I was 11 when you met me. You could have explained any of it, the prophecy, the stakes, the war. I was 11, not an infant. You chose not to because asking is a transaction between equals and you were not operating a system of equals." Dumbledore was very still. This was the stillness Aphrodite's instruction had predicted, not the stillness of a man caught out or ashamed, the stillness of a man listening to a serious counterargument and running it against his own architecture and finding, in real time, that it does not create the structural damage he has been trained to avoid. He said, "You were a child." "Yes," Harry said, "you drugged a child for 3 years. The fact that I was a child makes it worse." A pause. "At 11, Dumbledore said, measured, the conversation you describe would have been uncomfortable," Harry said, "difficult, possibly traumatic. But it would have been mine." He looked at Dumbledore without looking away, and he did not feel the old pull, the old need for the headmaster's approval, the old compulsion to soften the edges of his position. Those grooves were simply gone. You didn't make a mistake in the method and get the principle right. The principle was the mistake. You decided that you were permitted to own the shape of my life. Percy said from the chair, "I'd like to speak to the administrative component." Dumbledore's gaze moved to him. Percy did not look up from his notebook immediately. He finished what he was writing. Harry could see it was a verbatim transcript of Dumbledore's explanation, the key phrases double underlined, and then he looked up. "I've worked at the ministry for 8 months, Percy said. In that time, I have received no formal acknowledgement of any work product above the grade of satisfactory, which my supervisors have verbally characterized differently in private, on 4 separate occasions, in terms I would characterize as excellent. I have been passed over for 2 internal transfers to departments I was better qualified for than the candidates selected, and I have received 0 responses to 3 separate recommendation requests I submitted through appropriate channels to appropriate figures." He spoke like he was reading a regulation, each clause precise, each comma audible. "I was considered for this triwizard assignment because my direct supervisor, not Dumbledore, not order adjacent, made a recommendation that went to a committee, not through the channels that appear to have been subject to interference. This is the first substantive assignment I have received." He looked at Dumbledore. "You've known my family my entire life, Percy." "I was 11 when you came to my house," Percy said. "I remember the visit. I was proud. My parents were proud. You were gracious." The word sat between them. "I would have done anything you asked. My whole family would have done anything you asked. You didn't need compounds for us. You had us completely. A beat. So the compounds weren't about loyalty. They were about control, which is a different thing." The distinction landed. Dumbledore looked at Percy with the expression of a man being asked to re-examine a foundation stone, the specific effort, in real time, of a person who has built a great deal on top of a given premise and is now being asked to look at the premise. He said, "The Order is fighting a war. In wars, reliable agents are." "I'm 20 years old," Percy said, "and I'm not an agent. I'm a person who is trying to build a career in public service, which is a legal and respectable ambition, and which you interfered with because I was useful to you in a lower position." He looked down at his notebook again. I don't have Harry's argument to make. I'm not a prophecy child. I'm a civil servant from a Weasley family in Ottery St. Catchpole. The only reason to suppress my autonomy was to keep the Weasley family tractable through me, and to keep me within operational reach without the inconvenience of me having actual leverage. He paused. That's not war calculus, that's just control. Dumbledore said nothing. This was different from the stillness before. This was the stillness of a man for whom a door has opened in a familiar room and revealed a room he had told himself didn't exist. Harry watched it happen. He thought, this is the moment Dumbledore realizes that some of what he did was not the war at all. It was habit. The habit of control. The way of a man who has managed people for so long that management has become his native language, and it never occurred to him that not everything required managing. He thought it won't change anything, and he was correct. Dumbledore said, I would like to speak to both of you about what happens next. So would I, Percy said. I'll begin. He turned to a new page in his notebook. I have a sealed diagnostic record from St. Mungo's, produced at 1:15 this morning by healer Oshiro, certifying the presence of magical compound residue in both my bloodstream and Harry's, with a dated resonance map that establishes the historical duration of exposure. I have sent at 3:15 this morning a documented communication to Amelia Bones at Magical Law Enforcement, notifying her of the existence of that record and requesting a consultative meeting at her earliest convenience. I have a 19-point timeline, 17 documented incidents plus the compound start dates, organized chronologically and supported by contemporaneous evidence where available. He looked at Dumbledore. I am not filing criminal charges this morning. I am placing the architecture in position. What happens next depends heavily on what is said in this room. Dumbledore considered this. That is, he said after a moment, a well-organized position. Thank you, Percy said without warmth. I would observe, Dumbledore said, that Amelia Bones, while scrupulous, operates within a ministry that has, at various points, actively worked against Harry's interests. That any public proceeding drawing on this material would expose Harry to scrutiny and risk that. Yes, Harry said, I know. And it's my risk to take. He held Dumbledore's gaze. That's what I mean, it's mine. Dumbledore unfolded his hands in his lap, folded them again. It was the only movement he made that was not entirely governed. What is it you want from me, Harry? Harry had thought about this between 3 and 6 in the morning, in the flat cold dark of the hospital wing, lying on a starched pillow and running the question. Not what would be satisfying. He had no use for satisfaction as a goal. Not what would be just. He understood justice was a long game category that would take years to work through. What he wanted from this room this morning, this conversation, he said, I want you to stop. Specify, Dumbledore said, the compounds, the management. Treating me like a piece in your game. Harry kept his voice flat, precise. I don't need the loyalty binding. I don't need my instincts suppressed. I will fight Voldemort. I have always been willing to fight Voldemort. That's not manufactured, that's actual, that's mine. You could have had my actual willingness for free. You paid for a fake version instead, which is the worst trade I've ever heard of, but that's your problem. He paused. I'll fight the war. I will do what I'm capable of doing, and I am considerably more capable than your managed version of me was ever allowed to demonstrate. In return, I operate as a person and not a piece. And if I refuse, Dumbledore said, not as a threat. As a genuine inquiry. Then Percy files Monday morning and we see what Amelia Bones makes of a 14-year-old boy with a 3-year diagnostic record. Harry paused. And I stop cooperating with any order structure entirely. I fight the war as an individual operating on my own assessment. Which, I want to be honest with you, is probably worse for you than the alternative. Dumbledore looked at him, a long look, the kind that reads, You've changed overnight, he said. I've changed in the last 9 hours, Harry said. Without the suppressants, my assessment is faster. The self-assertion channel is, apparently, fairly significant. He said this without pride. As a fact, Dumbledore made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite acknowledgement, something in between. The sound of a man at the edge of his own architecture, feeling the structure hold but understanding that the load has changed. He said, I will consider what you've said. Percy said, that is not a commitment. No, Dumbledore agreed, it is not. Then I'll be more specific, Percy said. What I require from you on behalf of myself personally is a written acknowledgement, not public, not filed, simply in your own hand and witnessed, that the recommendation letters from my first 6 months at the ministry were redirected through order-adjacent channels. I require this by the end of this week. In return, I don't add your name to the documentation I'm placing with Amelia Bones as an identified person of interest." He paused. "I'll be transparent, even with your written acknowledgement, I may eventually add your name, but not this week. This week, I am giving you the opportunity to demonstrate that certain choices were aberrations rather than policy." The room was very quiet. Dumbledore said, "That is an extraordinary demand from a junior ministry employee." "Yes," Percy said. "The compounds are gone, so is the deference they were producing." He met Dumbledore's eyes directly, and his own eyes were the precise pale blue of a man who has spent 20 years cataloging every infraction in every room he stood in and has finally arrived at the infraction that merits full deployment of the catalog. "I'm quite good at my job, headmaster. You've spent 7 months ensuring that nobody noticed. You may find the unconstrained version considerably less convenient." Madame Pomfrey had been in the supply room at the far end of the ward during the entire conversation, and she had been in the supply room in the specific way of someone who is not in the supply room at all, but has made the professional determination that her presence as a witness is more useful than her presence as a participant. She came out now with a small tray of potions, and she set them on the bedside table, and she looked at Dumbledore and said, "My patients need to eat Albus. There's breakfast in the Great Hall." It was the most loaded dietary recommendation in the history of the hospital wing. Dumbledore rose, straight, composed, unhurried. He looked at Harry for a long moment. He looked at Percy. His expression was not the expression of a man defeated. It was the expression of a man who has been given new information and is in the process of incorporating it into a system that will, in due course, produce a new and probably very careful response. He said, "This conversation is not finished." "No," Harry said, "it's not." Dumbledore left. His footsteps on the stone were even measured, each one landing with intention. The door closed behind him without drama. Madame Pomfrey put a bowl of porridge in Harry's hands and another on the table beside Percy's chair and said, "Eat," and then went back to the supply room and this time appeared to actually be in it. Percy ate standing up, still reading his notebook, making occasional small additions with the pen held in his non-spoon hand. Harry looked at the porridge. It was hot and plain and real, and he was aware of the temperature of it in a way he had not been aware of the temperature of food since he could not remember when. A sensory signal arriving clean, not modulated, not routed through a system with a managed output. He ate it. "Bones will respond today," Percy said. "She's the type." "What do you tell your family?" Harry asked. Percy was quiet for a moment. "The truth," he said. "Eventually, right now, my mother would go straight to Dumbledore to ask him to explain, and my father would try to see both sides, and Ron would." He stopped. "Right now, I protect the record's integrity by limiting access." He paused. "And I need a few days to decide how to be in the same room as my family, knowing that their devotion to the order was, in part, the architecture Dumbledore used to access me." He turned a page. "That's a separate process." "Yeah," Harry said. "Do you have anyone?" Percy said it without looking up. Matter of fact, not gentle. Harry thought about it. "Hermione will believe me immediately and have 17 recommendations within the first 10 minutes. Ron will take it personally about his family and then come round." He looked at the ceiling. Sirius? He hadn't thought about Sirius yet. Sirius, who was outside the management system. Sirius, who had been in Azkaban for 12 of Harry's 14 years and who had therefore been unavailable as a target for any of the loyalty bonding, and who had looked at Harry from their first meeting with an expression that Harry now understood differently. The expression of someone seeing Harry as fully as the unmediated version of Harry was, and being startled by it. He thought, "Sirius needs to know today. I'll need to write some letters," Harry said. "The desk is there," Percy said, gesturing at the writing table near the window without looking up, which was precisely the Percy answer to the statement. Harry went to the desk. He sat down. He pulled a piece of parchment toward him and picked up the quill and held it over the page for a moment. The morning light was very cold and very clear. Through the window he could see the castle grounds in their December frosting, the Quidditch pitch, the lake, the forest. Hogwarts from the outside looked exactly the way it had always looked. That was the nature of the thing. The compound had not changed the castle. It had changed him in the castle so that what should have been extraordinary, the safety, the belonging, the home, was instead managed into a mild, useful comfort, reliable, compliant. He thought about the word home. He held it in his mind without the compliance compound and felt it land differently, larger, and much more complicated. He started writing to Sirius. He wrote the way he always wrote to Sirius, direct, brief, no softening, and he wrote more than he'd ever written in a letter to anyone because there was more to say and he now had the complete, unmediated capacity to say it. While he wrote, Percy said, "For what it's worth, and I'm aware that phrase carries some weight right now given that I used it last night and you've spent the night assessing the value of various vouched things, I think he will give ground." Dumbledore. On the management structure, yes, not out of guilt, out of operational calculation. He's assessed you as a more capable asset unmanaged than managed, and his instinct will be to adapt the management rather than abandon it. Percy turned a page. He'll try softer approaches next. Persuasion, effective manipulation but manufactured rather than chemical. He'll try to have the genuine relationship he should have built in the first instance. "Will it work?" Harry asked. "On you." Percy looked up. "No, you know what the genuine version was supposed to feel like now. You'll have a reference point." He paused. "That's what she actually gave you, not the removal of the compound. The removal of the compound is the mechanism. The gift is the reference point." Harry stopped writing. He looked at Percy. "That was," Harry said, "almost profound." "I have my moments," Percy said, and went back to writing. Amelia Bones sent a response at 9:17. The owl arrived with the specific authority of a bird that had been given to understand its cargo mattered, and it dropped the sealed letter directly onto Percy's open notebook, which was either magical instinct or very good owl training. Percy read it. "She wants to meet today, her office, 2 o'clock. He looked at Harry. "She wants to meet both of us." "Both of us," Harry said. "Apparently." Percy folded the letter precisely. "She signed it herself, not a secretary." He looked at the letter again. "She used the word urgent. Amelia Bones does not use the word urgent lightly." Harry had been writing for 40 minutes and had produced 3 letters. One to Sirius, one to Hermione with a note that she share it with Ron at her own judgment, and one to, after some thought, Remus Lupin, who was outside the school and outside the Order's direct management structure for the current year, and who had once looked at Harry in the shrieking shack with a grief so undisguised it had frightened Harry a little, and who deserved to know. He sealed all 3, took them to the window. The Hogwarts owls came to this window from the owlery he'd learned that first year, sick with something, staring at the same crack in the ceiling. He leaned on the windowsill and looked out at the grounds while the owls sorted themselves. The castle had woken up. He could see students moving across the grounds, wrapped in coats against the December cold, and he could see the small gathering near the main entrance that meant people were discussing last night, the collapse, the chandelier, the extinguished snowflakes. He was going to walk back into that later and be the person the event had happened to, and that was a thing he would deal with in its turn. He thought about what Dumbledore had said, the word necessary, 4 times over, each time a toll. He thought about the version of that argument that was genuinely true. The war was real. Voldemort was real. The stakes were total, none of that was manufactured. The terrible thing about Dumbledore was not that he had invented a threat, the threat was entirely genuine. The terrible thing was that he had looked at the genuine threat and decided that it authorized the manufacture of people, and he had not found this difficult. He had found it unfortunate, which was different, necessary. Harry thought, "I will fight the war because the war is mine. Because it started in my family's living room when I was 1 year old, and because the scar on my forehead is real, and because people are dying, and that is enough by itself to warrant fighting. None of that requires a compound system. None of that requires managed autonomy." He would have gotten there. He had always been getting there. The owl took the letter to Sirius and launched from the sill, and the cold air came in through the open window for a moment before he closed it. He said without turning, "Will you come with me today to Bones?" Percy said, "I was going regardless." "I know." "I meant together." There was a pause, the kind that meant Percy was recognizing the distinction between 2 things and acknowledging it. "Yes," he said, "together." They left the hospital wing at 11. Madame Pomfrey stood in the doorway and watched them go with an expression she did not characterize and Harry did not name, but which contained in some compressed form the complete weight of everything she had observed over 3 years of treating a boy who had arrived at her ward too often and taken too long to ask for help, and who had left each time slightly reduced, and who was leaving now slightly enlarged, and who had never known the difference because he had not been permitted to. She went back inside and the door closed. The corridor was empty. Morning lessons were underway. The castle had the focused quiet of hours where everyone is supposed to be somewhere doing something assigned. Harry and Percy walked without hurrying. Harry's magic sat in his chest the way it had been sitting since 9 o'clock last night, present clean his. He felt the texture of it differently in the castle now. The castle had the ambient compound still in its water system, Aphrodite had said, but the system was external now, not internal. His own system was clean. The compound could not build back up in a cleared host in under 48 hours, and by 48 hours he would be taking steps. He would be taking several steps by 48 hours. As they passed the first-floor corridor, Malfoy came around the corner from the other direction with Crabbe and Goyle at his shoulders and the specific expression of someone who had spent the night assembling material and was looking for an audience. He said, "Potter, fall down a lot, do you, or just on special occasions?" Harry looked at him. It was a direct look. No apology in it, no defensive brace, just the clear, complete, fully resourced attention of someone who is no longer managing themselves down to an acceptable level. Malfoy's expression did something. Not a flinch, he was not the flinching type, but a recalibration. The look had landed differently than all the other looks Harry had ever given him, and the difference was legible, and it required recalibration. "We're going somewhere," Harry said. "Move." Malfoy moved. He didn't appear to decide to move, he simply did. Crabbe and Goyle moved with him, and Harry and Percy walked past without looking back, and the corridor clicked back to its ordinary acoustic signature. And Percy, for the first time since last night, made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You didn't even raise your wand," Percy said. "Didn't need to," Harry said. The Great Hall at lunchtime was loud and bright and full of the noise of an event that had happened and was now being talked about. Harry walked in from the side entrance and he felt the change in the room's quality immediately, not all heads turning, just a shift, a wave of awareness moving outward from his entry point, the specific attention that attaches to the person a thing happened to. He did not perform smallness, he got food, he sat down, he ate, he was aware of the attention and neither sought it nor managed it away. Hermione slid into the seat across from him 4 minutes later with an expression that said she had read his letter and already had 15 things to say and was organizing them by priority. "Not here," Harry said. "When?" she said. "Tonight, bring Ron," he paused, "and bring everything you know about Wisengamot procedure for presenting magical diagnostic evidence because Percy's going to need a second pair of eyes on his documentation strategy." Hermione looked at Percy, who was sitting 2 seats down reading his notebook while eating. "Percy," she said discreetly. "He's on our side," Harry said. "He's been on our side since 11 p.m. last night and he went to St. Mungo's at midnight and built a legal case before breakfast, so he took a bite of his food. Be respectful." She absorbed this with the focused attention of someone restructuring a previously held position. "All right," she said, "tonight." Harry looked at the high table. Dumbledore was in his chair eating, speaking quietly to Professor McGonagall. He looked like a headmaster at lunch. Warm, present, the comfortable weight of institutional authority. His hands were on the table, both of them. His left hand rested near his plate. Easy, still. Harry looked at him across the Great Hall for a moment. Dumbledore, as if feeling the weight of the look, glanced down the Gryffindor table. Their eyes met. Dumbledore's expression held its warmth. It held its composure. It held the specific gentleness of a man who is already, behind those eyes, composing the next approach, the next adaptation, the patient, methodical rethinking of an architecture that had been compromised. He was not defeated. He was not panicked. He was recalculating. Harry held the look for 3 seconds, then he looked away, back to his food. Back to the table and the noise of the hall and the specific warmth of a December noon, and Hermione across from him with her list of organized thoughts and Percy somewhere in his notebook and 3 letters in the air heading toward 3 people who deserved to know. The fight was not over. It had not been won. What had changed, the only thing that had definitively changed, was that it was now honest. Both sides knew where the other stood. Both sides knew what the other was capable of. No more compounds. No more managed compasses pointing 4 degrees off north while you walked in the wrong direction and blamed your own sense of the land. The fight was honest. For 2 boys who had spent years fighting shadows they weren't allowed to see clearly, that was precisely and entirely enough.